Well, hi, everyone. This is one of these things that I've got to figure out with my computer system. So I'm back online here to talk about J. Allen Hynek, Project Blue Book, and the rest. Thanks for sticking around. Um, I was just saying that, Hynek was a team player, without a doubt, um, but that he also seemed to have an independent mind when it came to this UFO phenomenon. I was talking about a speech he gave back in 1960 to the Air Force, and he's talking about how this seems to be a legitimate, real phenomenon. Like, this is not make believe, fun and games, anything like that. He talked about these UFO cases from 1954 in France, which I thought was actually quite shocking. Talking to the U.S. Air Force here about these sightings, he even talked about a very interesting case in the U.S. Southwestern case relating to a scientist named Charles Moore from 1949. It's well known to researchers, but I'm glad that he mentioned this to the Air Force. And basically, Moore was a balloon expert over at White Sands Proving Ground, doing with very excellent technical qualifications. He had a team of 5 other technicians with him. They were doing high altitude launches of balloons for the military, with military applications. And they had these instruments known as theodolites, which are designed to measure altitude and speed of objects that are in the air. So they're great when there's a UFO sighting happen. And theodolites from time to time have been useful in this. And it happened with Charles Moore on April 24th, 1949. He and his team tracked a high altitude, very fast object zooming across the sky. Hynek was talking about this Moore sighting in his speech, and he said, look, I spoke to Moore myself. This man had very good reasons for ruling out aircraft, for ruling out balloons, for ruling out any other kind of natural phenomena. So here's Allen Hynek talking about these very, very interesting cases to Air Force personnel. And there was one quote in there that I thought, this is just really beautiful. He says, we might say that just as we plan in some years hence to send a probe to some other planet to take a sample of the surface and return, so this might have been an interplanetary probe from elsewhere, which picked up its sample and went off. He says there's nothing in the facts that would contradict it, but I'm sure, he says, that none of us here would accept that explanation without a great deal more corroborative evidence. Fair enough, there he is being the scientist. But I just love how Hynek, during this speech way back in 1960, during the depths of the years when he's working as a team player for Project Blue Book and for the Air Force, he's where he can quietly, he's saying to these guys, hey, look, there is something very serious, and there's nothing illogical about this being extraterrestrial intelligence. And then he just goes on, he closes, and he says, look, can some of these really be mass hallucinations, as the Air Force is saying, even when you have a dozen people seeing the same thing independently of each other in different locations? Seriously? Or he says, how can a mirage travel from one end of the sky to the other and then hang around in that little area for another hour or so? Because those types of cases have been reported. Mirage? Not really, in Hynek's opinion. So he suggested, again, way back then, this is over 56, 58, almost 60 years ago, he said, what we need really, if you want to do this right, you want to study UFO scientifically, you need an interdisciplinary panel. He said physicists, psychologists, all other kinds of technically qualified people need to be studying this, because the UFO phenomenon is actually a very, very complex subject. So I really like that about Hynek. Now, he was still sort of working within the physics of 1960. In other words, I think a lot of physics today is a bit more out there in terms of finding end runs around the light speed limitation and so forth. And Hynek really never got to that point. He says, look, we can't really defeat the speed of light, so it's very unlikely that we're going to see visitors from other star systems. But hey, you never know. Maybe there's someone who figured something out. That's essentially where he leaves it. You've got physicists today, at least on the fringe, but legitimate physicists, who are indeed talking about things like warp speed and defeating the light speed barrier by warping space and time and so forth. But that's for another lecture. So that was Hynek back then. Now, what happened as the 1960s moved on is that, it looked like for a while that the US government and the Air Force would have their way and debunk UFOs for the public and just keep it that way. But then came the year 1966. What was important about that year is that in the United States particularly, UFOs went off the charts, through the roof numbers of sightings. They were everywhere, just like the year 1952 had been, maybe even more. Lots and lots of sightings. And so it became an issue. And in fact, it had been part of a crescendo because 1965 had been a very busy year for UFO sightings. So suddenly in March of 1966, in a little town called Dexter, Michigan, there was a number of individuals, including a bunch of college students, who had seen what surely looked like explicit UFO craft hovering in the area. Hynek flies into Dexter and he gives a press conference after a couple of interviews and looking around, and he says, and this is really a famous and very unfortunate press conference for J. Allen Hynek. He says, well, there's a swampy area, there's a lot of marshy ground there, and there's vapors that come up, and the interplay of the vapors and the light and then the press said, are you saying swamp gas caused these sightings? And Hynek never used the phrase swamp gas explicitly, but he might as well have. And here's the funny thing. Back in the 1960s, when the Air Force was explaining UFOs away, often so ridiculously, like the public realized that these explanations were not credible. And so it became very fashionable at times to make fun of the Air Force's UFO explanations. And it's not that everyone was believing in UFOs, but people really did at times like to laugh at how silly the Air Force explanations of UFOs were, because they really were. And so here comes Hynek. This is the coup de grace, swamp gas. In 1966, people just laughed their heads off, and the Air Force ended up looking very bad. Hynek looked bad. And so as a result of this, a couple of things happened. The big one is that the Air Force finally said, all right, we're going to get this UFO albatross off our necks. All right. And so they said, we're going to hire an independent university, and they're going to do a scientific study of this. And they're just going to tell us what the deal is. And that's going to be the end of it. And if they say there's nothing to it, we're out. They didn't put it that way, but that's exactly what they meant. And that ended up with the University of Colorado being paid about $500,000 by the Air Force to do a scientific study of UFOs. That became known as the Condon Committee. Went from 1966 to the end of 1968. During that period, I think what really did happen with Allen Hynek is after the whole Michigan swamp gas fiasco, he really went through a change publicly, and he became very outspoken for the legitimacy of UFOs. I think particularly you go back to 1966 and 67 when all of this was going on and the scientific study was happening. It might have been easier to think, some kind of disclosure is going to happen. I'm going to get on the right side of this issue. And I suspect that might have been. And I think also there's just the fact that Hynek was, tired of holding back his opinion all these years. So he begins to come out more and more on the reality of UFOs. At the beginning of 1969, after the University of Colorado said, yeah, Air Force is totally right, nothing to UFOs, they should just get out of the whole UFO business. That whole study was a rigged game, but I'll talk about that another time. Hynek stayed with the UFO subject, wrote several books, one called The UFO Experience, one called The Hynek UFO Report. They're both good books. And he created an organization known as the Center for UFO Studies. Known as CUFOS, they exist to this day. And the whole focus, what Allen Hynek was about, was the scientific study of UFOs, what has often been called scientific ufology. I think it's fair to say that J. Allen Hynek was the number one inspiration for scientific ufology. And incidentally, it's a hard thing to do. UFOs demand true scientific analysis But of course, as I've always said, science means money. If you don't have money, you're not really going to be able to do much science in the study of UFOs. But having said that, you can approach a subject in a scientific manner as opposed to an unscientific manner. And I would say that J. Allen Hynek has absolutely inspired several generations now of UFO researchers to approach this subject as scientifically as possible. My overall take on J. Allen Hynek is that this was a scientist who became genuinely interested in UFOs, but was also powerless to really fight the Air Force on this. He had to play along. And, had he been a little more of a combative kind of personality, maybe he would have had a confrontation with them about this much earlier than he did. But that just isn't how he was. Many years ago, when I was a bit younger myself, I had a bit more of a hard-nosed attitude about Hynek, maybe a little more than I do today. I do think, as I thought back then, that Hynek, played along maybe too much with the Air Force, and there seems to be this underhanded, or at least an undercurrent of working within the system that we often forget about with Hynek these days. But on the other hand, it's easy for us to forget the mindset of the 1940s and 1950s in the United States, when this was a nation that had fought the Second World War. Patriotism was unquestioned. Working with the military was basically unquestioned back in those days. It was your patriotic duty to work for your nation. And I think it's fair to say that this is how Hynek saw his role at that time. But he did make that important decision in 1966 and became the face of ufology for many years. In fact, I think one magazine referred to him as the Galileo of the study of UFOs. I think that's going a little too far, but it is true that Allen Hynek was a very, very important key figure in ufology for many years. I was told by one researcher who knew Hynek that at the end of his life in 1985, 86, he was a bit depressed over the fact that the Air Force continually, he said, locked him out of the real truth. In other words, Allen Hynek did pay a price. You dance with the Air Force, they're not going to give you all the information, even despite your life's work of cooperation. He always felt that they were hiding critical information about the reality of this phenomenon. Keep in mind, back in the 50s and 60s, no one was talking really about crash retrievals. No one was talking about the Air Force having hardware to study. None of that came about until the end of the 70s and early 1980s at the beginning. And so by the end of his life, though, Hynek started to recognize the likelihood, I think, that the Air Force and other military agencies, and probably the CIA, were deeply involved in this phenomenon in ways that he had probably never imagined throughout his life, and said to this one individual, why won't they, or why wouldn't they tell me the truth? A sad testament to the end of a lifetime of work on a subject that so many of us are interested in. And I think it's a testament to the secrecy that continues to dominate the subject of UFOs. Hynek lived through the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And here we are, all these years later. He's been gone for over 3 decades now, 32 years. And we have a little bit more information than we did back then. That's all true. But certain things haven't changed. The secrecy, the tight-lipped nature of what's going on behind the doors of the government and military, that hasn't changed. Hynek was dealing with it back then the best he could, and we're still dealing with it today. So that's a little bit about J. Allen Hynek. I think the program Blue Book coming out in a month should be interesting. I hope it'll turn out to be as good as the trailers have been. I think that it will be very interesting. I doubt that, Alan Hynek will be quite like Fox Mulder. I mean, he wasn't like a Fox Mulder in real life, running off into the woods with a flashlight looking for aliens. But nonetheless, I think that there's potential that this will be very interesting indeed. So that's it for this week. Catch you again. I'm Richard Dolan. Thanks.